The neon lights of Seoul bled through the rain-streaked floor-to-ceiling windows of Leon's penthouse office, like smeared watercolor. Each droplet was a quiet tick in the countdown of the storm raging outside. I stood exactly 3 paces from his obsidian glass desk, my resignation letter burning inside the leather folder pressed to my chest, waiting for him to finish a phone call that had already stretched 20 minutes past our scheduled briefing. He didn't acknowledge my presence. He never did. Not immediately, anyway. That was the cornerstone of the survival game we had played for 4 years, a suffocating dance of ruthless professional efficiency and a heavy, unspoken tension that coiled between us like a primed tripwire. Neither of us dared to breathe too heavily on it. "Burn the warehouses," Leon ordered into the receiver, his voice dropping into that dark, silken register that made the most violent syndicate bosses in Asia swallow hard. He looked effortlessly lethal, his sharp features illuminated by the city lights, the top buttons of his black shirt undone to reveal the subtle, coiled strength of his chest. His Korean was flawless, delivered with the terrifying, casual authority of a man accustomed to absolute, unquestioned obedience. If the triad thinks they can launch an unprovoked assault in my district and walk away, remind them what happens to ghosts who overstay their welcome. I kept my expression entirely neutral, subtly smoothing a hand over the fabric of my burgundy silk dress. I fixed my gaze on a point just past his right shoulder, where an antique, blood-grooved Joseon-era sword rested on a custom display stand under flawless gallery lighting. The blade was a relic of ancient, unapologetic slaughter, radiating a cold, beautiful deadliness I had come to understand intimately over my years as his indispensable fixer. Leon hoarded power the way other men hoarded money. He finally ended the call, tossing the sleek phone onto the obsidian glass of his desk. The silence that rushed in to fill the room was deafening. He turned to face me, and the dim penthouse lighting caught the stark white medical bandaging wrapped tightly around his ribs, just visible beneath the unbuttoned silk of his black shirt. The clinic staff had ordered 2 weeks of absolute bed rest after last week's warehouse ambush, but Lee-Yeon had lasted exactly 2 days before tearing out his IV lines. Even wounded, his sheer physical presence was a suffocating force. I stepped forward, bridging the careful 3-foot distance we always maintained, and placed the leather folder gently on the edge of his desk. It felt exponentially heavier than the concealed weapons I regularly carried for him. The final logistics reports from the Incheon docks are filed, and beneath them is my formal notice. I am stepping down as your lead strategist. His eyes, impossibly dark and unreadable, dropped to the folder and then slowly rose to meet mine. He didn't blink. He didn't reach for the paper. Instead, he smoothly closed the remaining space between us, entirely ignoring the fresh stitches protesting in his torso. My breath hitched as he stopped mere inches away, his towering frame casting a long shadow over me. The intoxicating scent of expensive sandalwood, ozone, and the faint metallic tang of his healing wounds enveloped my senses. "Stepping down," he repeated softly, testing the syllables on his tongue as if they were a foreign language. "It is time," I forced myself to say, holding my ground even as every survival instinct screamed at me to step back, or perhaps, terrifyingly, to lean into his chest. "I've spent 4 years in the blood and shadows of this syndicate. I need a life outside of it before there is nothing left of my soul to salvage. A quiet life." I swallowed hard, steeling myself for the final severing blow. "I've accepted a courtship. Jinwoo is a civilian. He runs a tech firm. It's safe, Leon. It's a real future." The shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and violent. The air grew paralyzingly heavy. The casual, aristocratic authority he had just wielded over the phone shattered, replaced by something much darker and far more primal. His gaze flicked down to my lips, then back up to my eyes, burning with a territorial ferocity that made my pulse roar in my ears. He didn't shout, he didn't throw the folder across the room. He simply reached out, his large hand gently but immovably gripping my jaw, his thumb brushing against my cheekbone. The touch was agonizingly tender, yet it felt exactly like a steel trap springing shut. "Safe," he murmured, leaning down until his lips hovered a breath away from mine. "You think you can just walk away into the light, Areola, with another man?" The 48 hours following my resignation felt like holding my breath underwater. I remained in the penthouse suite, managing the final handover of the syndicate's encrypted ledgers, desperately ignoring the bruised territorial hunger in Lee-Yeon's gaze every time I entered the room. He remained confined to his heavy leather chair, a bitter concession to the freshly bleeding stitches beneath his bandages, but his physical immobility did nothing to lessen his lethal reach. He spent hours on secure lines, speaking in low, clipped tones that I mistakenly assumed pertained solely to the triad's recent aggressions. I had arranged to meet Jin-woo for a quiet lunch, seeking desperate refuge in the predictable safety of my impending civilian life, but he never arrived. Instead, my encrypted phone buzzed with a sudden cascade of frantic news alerts. Jin-woo's tech firm, a rising titan in Seoul's software development sector, was an absolute freefall. Overnight, his 3 primary venture capital backers had simultaneously pulled their funding, without a single word of explanation. Hours later, his proprietary code was mysteriously flagged for international embargo violations, freezing his overseas assets and triggering an immediate and devastating raid by the National Tax Agency. The financial execution was flawless, surgical, and utterly ruthless. It was an engineered slaughter. I stood in the center of my sterile office, the harsh glow of the financial newsfeed illuminating my face as a terrifying realization crystallized in my chest. Jin-woo was ruined. His entire life's work was suddenly a smoking crater, leaving him drowning in manufactured debt and facing potential federal charges. He could no longer offer me a safe harbor. He couldn't even save himself. He would be fighting for his freedom for the next decade. My feet carried me down the corridor toward Lee-Yeon's office before I could fully process the accusation forming in my mind. Pushing open the heavy mahogany doors, I found him bathed in the slate-gray daylight of the storm, reviewing a digital dossier. He didn't look up, his beautiful face a mask of serene, unbothered calm that chilled me to the bone. Jin-woo's servers were seized at dawn. The words hung heavy in the silent room. Lee-Yeon slowly turned a page on his tablet, wincing slightly as his injured ribs shifted, before finally lifting his impossibly dark eyes to mine. "A tragedy of corporate mismanagement," he murmured smoothly, his tone laced with dark amusement. "The tech sector is notoriously unstable. It is a dangerous world out there for civilians who do not know how to protect what they claim is theirs." He leaned back, the very picture of predatory patience. He hadn't just destroyed a man's empire, he had systematically annihilated my only escape route, brick by brick, without ever leaving his desk. And as I stared into the endless, unapologetic void of his gaze, I knew with absolute certainty that he would burn the rest of the city to the ground before he ever let me walk away. The clinking of crystal glasses and the muted hum of a live-stringed quartet should have been a sanctuary. Instead, the atmosphere of the exclusive Michelin-starred dining room grated against my nerves like dull iron. I sat in a velvet booth, staring at the perfectly plated sea bass in front of me, feeling absolutely nothing. Across the table, Jin-woo was a portrait of a man unraveling. Despite the catastrophic dismantling of his company over the past 48 hours, he had insisted on keeping this dinner reservation, a desperate, hollow pantomime of the stable, insulated life he had promised to give me. His face was drawn, his movements jerky, and his eyes darted constantly to his vibrating phone. He spoke rapidly about retaining crisis lawyers, liquidating his remaining personal assets, and filing endless appeals. "We can still make this work, Areola," he urged, reaching across the white linen tablecloth to grasp my hand. His palm was damp with nervous sweat. "It's a setback, a massive one, but I'll protect you from the fallout. We can move to Jeju, start over quietly." I looked down at his trembling fingers, then back up to his earnest, terrified face. When a waiter accidentally dropped a silver serving tray 2 tables away, the sudden clatter made Jinwoo violently flinch in his seat. The realization hit me with the quiet, devastating force of a triggered landmine. I gently withdrew my hand from his. I took a slow sip of my Bordeaux, letting the expensive vintage wash over my tongue, but it tasted entirely like ash. For 4 years, my nervous system had been meticulously calibrated to the rhythm of high-stakes survival. I was accustomed to a world where power was spoken in silken threats, where danger was the very air we breathed, and where a man could orchestrate international ruin without ever raising his voice. Sitting here in this gilded room, listening to a civilian scramble for the scraps of his shattered dignity, I felt a suffocating, paralyzing boredom. The safe life I had so desperately craved was nothing more than a beautifully painted cage, completely devoid of the electric razor wire tension that actually made me feel alive. I didn't want peace. I didn't want a quiet retreat to the coast. I missed the smell of ozone and blood. I missed the suffocating weight of a gaze that promised absolute devotion and absolute destruction in the exact same breath. "I'm sorry, Jinwoo," I said softly, smoothly rising from the table and leaving my glass half full. I didn't wait for his confused, heartbroken reply. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cold, rain-slicked streets of Seoul, my pulse finally beating in a steady, determined rhythm, knowing exactly whose beautiful, terrifying darkness I was returning to. I stepped out of the private elevator and into the suffocating quiet of the penthouse. The heavy mahogany doors to his office were slightly ajar, spilling a sliver of cool, rain-washed light into the corridor. I pushed them open, the thick carpet swallowing the sound of my heels. The moment I crossed the threshold, the doors clicked shut behind me with the unmistakable heavy thud of an electronic deadbolt engaging. I turned, but the locking mechanism was already dark. Trapped. Lee-Yeon stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a striking silhouette against the neon-drenched cityscape of Seoul. Despite the strict medical orders regarding his recovering ribs, he was fully dressed in a tailored black suit, having traded his bandages for the immaculate, intimidating armor of his station. The only betraying sign of his recent trauma was the rigid, guarded set of his broad shoulders. "Did he cry?" Lee-Yeon asked. His voice was a velvet rasp in the quiet room, devoid of mockery, yet echoing with a devastating, arrogant certainty. He turned slowly to face me. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the dangerous, predatory glint in his eyes. He didn't wait for my answer. He began to cross the room, his stride slow and deliberate, a predator cornering its prey. My breath hitched as he backed me against the solid wood of the locked door. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm fueled by adrenaline and something entirely more perilous. "You couldn't protect you," Lee-Yeon murmured. He stopped close enough that the heat of his body radiated against mine, the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and ozone washing over me. He reached out, his knuckles lightly brushing down the side of my neck to trace the frantic pulse jumping beneath my skin. You couldn't even protect himself. It was a fragile civilian illusion. "You destroyed him," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper, refusing to break his paralyzing gaze. "You tore apart his life just to keep me here." "I tore it apart because he dared to court what is mine," he corrected softly. his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with an ancient, terrifying possessiveness. He leaned in, his large hands coming up to frame my jaw, his thumbs gently sweeping over my cheekbones. The carefully constructed mask of professional distance I had worn for 4 relentless years began to fracture under the sheer, suffocating weight of his proximity. I wanted to deny it, to push him away, to claim my righteous independence, but the electric, live-wire tension buzzing between us was undeniable. "You thought you could hide it behind ledgers and strategy meetings," he whispered, his lips grazing my ear, sending a violent shiver cascading down my spine. "You thought you could bury 4 years of absolute devotion under cold, ruthless efficiency. But I see every look, Areola. I feel every breath you hold when I walk into a room." He pulled back just enough to capture my gaze, his dark eyes burning with a triumphant, all-consuming fire that left absolutely nowhere to run. "I've always known." The words shattered the remaining fragments of my composure. 4 years of meticulous discipline, of burying every lingering glance and stifled breath beneath the cold facade of his lead strategist, evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat. I didn't step back. I couldn't. Instead, my hands reached out, my fingers curling fiercely into the crisp black silk of his lapels. I pulled him down, closing the final, agonizing inch between us. His mouth crashed down on mine, hungry and uncompromising. The kiss was a violent collision of suppressed yearning and territorial claim, tasting of dark whiskey, danger, and the metallic edge of adrenaline. He groaned, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated against my chest, his arms wrapping around me to crush my body against his. I felt the sudden, sharp hitch in his breath as the sudden movement aggravated his torn ribs. The medical bandaging wrapped tightly beneath his suit was a stark, physical reminder of the brutal treatment he had stubbornly abandoned just to ensure I didn't slip through his fingers. My hands immediately softened their grip, sliding from his lapels to gently trace the rigid line of his shoulders, fiercely mindful of the severe wounds he was trying so ruthlessly to ignore. "Lee-Yeon," I breathed against his lips, my voice laced with a sudden, protective panic. "Your stitches." "Forget them," he rasped, his eyes burning with a fever that had absolutely nothing to do with his injuries. "I have survived far worse. I have waited 4 years for you to look at me like this, Areola. I am not stopping now." He pressed me back against the heavy mahogany door, his imposing weight pinning me, warm and overwhelming. The kiss deepened, shifting from a desperate clash to something profoundly intimate, mapping the contours of my mouth with an agonizingly slow, deliberate heat. His thumb stroked the line of my jaw, while his other hand tangled in my hair, anchoring me to him as if he feared I might still vanish into the storm outside. Every touch felt like a live wire sparking against my skin, rewriting the fundamental rules of our existence. The professional boundary that had defined our every interaction was not just crossed, it was entirely incinerated. I was no longer merely the strategic mind plotting his syndicate's dominance, and he was no longer just the feared mastermind I served from the shadows. In the heavy, shadowed silence of his locked office, stripped of our titles and our armors, we were finally, terrifyingly equal in our ruinous desire. When he finally pulled back to rest his forehead against mine, we were both gasping for air. The fierce, unyielding syndicate leader was completely laid bare, his dark eyes vulnerable and fiercely possessive all at once. My hands rested lightly against the uninjured side of his chest, feeling the frantic, hammering rhythm of his heart beating perfectly in time with my own. The quiet life I had tried to force myself to want was entirely forgotten, replaced by the intoxicating, dangerous reality of the man I could no longer live without. The quiet intimacy of the locked office shattered with a deafening concussive roar. The floor-to-ceiling windows, engineered to withstand typhoon-force winds, exploded inward in a lethal, glittering shower of tempered glass and driving rain. Before my mind could even process the blast, Lee-Yeon moved. The fierce lover vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless syndicate leader. He seized my waist and violently threw us both behind the massive bulk of his obsidian desk, just as a barrage of suppressed automatic fire chewed through the thick mahogany doors. He landed heavily on his side, a sharp, ragged hiss tearing from his throat. The medical bandaging beneath his unbuttoned shirt rapidly bloomed with a dark, terrifying red as the torn stitches across his ribs finally gave way. He was still actively in treatment, supposed to be strictly confined to a clinical bed, not absorbing the physical shock of an explosive breach. Yet his hand remained clamped around my wrist in an iron grip, his dark eyes instantly scanning the shattered perimeter. Triad, he snarled, spitting a vicious curse as he blindly retrieved a sleek, high-caliber pistol from a magnetic lockbox concealed beneath the desk. They bypassed the private elevator, I said, my strategic mind aggressively overriding the lingering shock. The intoxicating haze of our kiss evaporated, instantly replaced by the icy, hyper-focused clarity that had kept his empire running for 4 years. I reached down, my fingers wrapping around the familiar textured grip of the stiletto blade hidden beneath the slit of my silk dress. The secondary grid was compromised during the storm. Heavy combat boots crunched over the broken glass in the corridor. Through the smoke pouring from the ruined doorway, 3 mercenaries clad in tactical black swept into the penthouse with the disciplined, terrifying silence of professional killers. Lee-Yeon surged upward to fire, his face pale and contorted with agony as the ripped muscles in his torso rebelled against the sudden, violent torque. His first shot took down the point man in a spray of crimson, but the heavy recoil caused him to stagger, his wounded side failing him in a critical fraction of a second. The second mercenary pivoted, bringing his short barrel rifle up to level perfectly with Lee-Yeon's chest. There was absolutely no time to shout. I didn't think, I executed. Lunging from the cover of the desk, I drove the distance with predatory speed. I drove my stiletto up and under the mercenary's tactical vest, burying the blade to the hilt in the vulnerable gap at his collarbone. He collapsed with a choked burgle. I spun around, fluidly stripping the sidearm from the falling man's holster, and leveled it at the third attacker, just as Lee-Yeon's second shot echoed like thunder through the room, dropping the final target instantly. Silence slammed back into the ruined office, broken only by the howling wind and the harsh rasp of Lee-Yeon's breathing. I turned back to him. He was clutching his bleeding side, leaning heavily against his desk, but his dark eyes were locked on me, blazing with a terrifying mixture of awe and feral pride. The line between us had been crossed in passion, but it had just been permanently sealed in blood. The storm howling through the shattered windows was swiftly drowned out by the harsh mechanical groan of the secondary freight elevators engaging. The first wave was only a vanguard. The rest of the Triad strike team was ascending. I shoved the captured sidearm into my hand and moved, my mind automatically shifting from the shock of our intimacy into the cold, calculated architecture of war. The emergency lockdown protocols, I shouted over the violent wind, sprinting toward the hidden biometric terminal behind the ruined bookshelf. If I manually override the severed breakers, I can bottleneck them in the south corridor. Do it, Lee-Yeon rasped. He was tearing a long strip of black silk from his ruined shirt, binding it tightly around his bleeding torso with a savage, uncompromising jerk that made the muscles in his jaw bulge. His face was a pale mask of sheer, stubborn adrenaline, actively warring against catastrophic physical trauma. He was still supposed to be on an IV drip, yet he checked the magazine of his pistol with a steady, lethal calm, the sharp metallic click sounding unnaturally loud. My fingers flew across the shattered keypad, splicing the backup commands. The penthouse abruptly plunged into absolute suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the eerie, strobing flash of neon city lights slicing through the rain. The heavy titanium security doors at the end of the hall slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss, trapping the advancing mercenaries in a narrow, windowless choke point. "Corridor locked," I breathed, raising my weapon. "But the blast doors won't hold structural explosives." "They don't need to hold long," Lee-Yeon murmured. He moved to stand perfectly at my back, his broad, solid warmth anchoring me in the freezing chaos of the ruined office. Even severely wounded, his presence was an impenetrable shield. I could feel the ragged, heavy rise and fall of his chest pressed against my spine. A muffled detonation violently rocked the floorboards, blowing the south doors off their hinges. Tactical laser sights immediately pierced the gloom, sweeping frantically across the debris. "Wait," I whispered, reaching back to rest my hand lightly against his thigh. I tracked the beams cutting through the smoke, perfectly calculating their tactical formation. 3, 2, I tapped him. Now. I triggered the industrial fire suppression system exclusively in their grid. A blinding high-pressure deluge of chemical foam erupted from the ceiling, instantly neutralizing their optics, slicking the floor, and throwing their formation into absolute panic. Lee-Yeon didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the cover of the dark like a phantom born of violence. His movements were a terrifying symphony of raw, predatory power. He didn't waste bullets. He executed. 3 suppressed shots dropped the vanguard before they could even wipe their visors. When the remaining 2 blindly fired into the dark, Lee-Yeon closed the distance with terrifying speed, entirely ignoring the fresh blood soaking through his makeshift bandage. He disarmed the closest mercenary with a brutal, bone-snapping strike, using the man's own momentum to shield himself while eliminating the final threat in a seamless, devastating arc. Silence rushed back into the foam-drenched hall. He stood amidst the wreckage, a wounded, untouchable king. He slowly turned to look at me, lowering his weapon. The terrifying violence in his eyes instantly melted into a dark, profound reverence. Together, in the blood and the dark, we had become an ecosystem of perfect, invincible synergy. The flashing emergency strobes painted the foam-drenched corridor in jagged bursts of crimson and shadow. As the final echo of gunfire was swallowed by the howling storm outside, the heavy metallic adrenaline that had fueled our survival began to recede, leaving the brutal reality of the night in its wake. Lee-Yeon dropped the empty magazine from his pistol, the metallic clatter deafening in the sudden, ringing silence. He swayed, the sheer drop in tension abruptly catching up with his traumatized body. I was instantly at his side, slipping my arm around his waist to bear his weight before his knees could buckle. He was still an active patient, a man whose severe wounds dictated he should be strictly confined to a clinical bed surrounded by monitors. Yet he was standing right next to me, refusing to fall even as the unbuttoned black silk of his shirt clung to his torso, soaked dark with fresh blood from his ruptured sutures. "I have the perimeter," I told him, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands as I keyed my secure radio. Within seconds, I dispatched the syndicate's elite cleanup crew, locked down the lower floors, and routed a retaliatory strike team to immediately annihilate the remaining triad lieutenants across the city. The attempted coup was decisively crushed before the sun could even rise. Our power was absolute. I guided him away from the shattered glass and the freezing wind, into the insulated, secure quiet of his private study. He sank onto the heavy leather sofa, his head falling back against the cushions as a ragged, agonizing breath escaped his lips. I retrieved the trauma kit from the wall safe, kneeling between his legs to carefully peel away the ruined silk binding his torso. The damage to his ribs was severe, the sutures completely torn open by the violent torque of combat. My hands, usually tasked with moving digital assets and signing execution orders, were surprisingly gentle as I cleaned the jagged wounds and applied fresh, pressure-sealed bandages. He didn't flinch. Instead, his dark eyes watched my face with an intense, burning clarity that made the air in the room feel impossibly thin. "You should be unconscious," I murmured, securing the final bandage and resting my palm lightly against his uninjured side. The steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat against my fingertips was a profound anchor. Lee-Yeon lifted his hand, his large, calloused fingers gently catching a stray lock of my hair. His thumb brushed against a drying smear of dust and blood on my cheek, a mark of the violence we had just conquered together. "If I had stayed in that medical bed, I would have lost you to the civilian world," he rasped, his voice thick with exhaustion and raw emotion. He pulled me forward, forcing me to lean into his chest, entirely ignoring the fresh pain. In the quiet aftermath of the slaughter, the truth settled over us with the heavy, undeniable weight of a finalized contract. We had survived the fire, not merely as a boss and his strategist, but as an invincible, terrifying whole. Dawn broke over Seoul, not with sunlight, but with the cold, bruised gray of a retreating storm. The city below was entirely oblivious to the subterranean war that had been waged and decisively won before breakfast. In the quiet sanctity of the private study, the scent of chemical foam and gunpowder had faded, replaced by the familiar, grounding aroma of sandalwood and antiseptic. Lee-Yeon was sitting on the edge of the heavy leather sofa, his broad chest wrapped tightly in fresh, pristine bandages. Despite the harrowing physical toll of the night, he flatly refused to lie back down. Instead, he watched me as I stood by the surviving bay window, relaying the final casualty reports and asset seizures through my encrypted earpiece. The rival Triad faction had been entirely dismantled. Our retaliation had been absolute and merciless. "The eastern docks are secure," I said, tapping the earpiece to end the transmission. I turned to face him, the adrenaline finally settling into a deep, grounding exhaustion. "The remaining lieutenants have surrendered their territories. The city is yours." "Ours," he corrected softly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. He stood up. The movement was slow, a reluctant concession to his traumatized ribs, but he held himself with the towering, unyielding grace of a monarch. He crossed the short distance between us, the dark silk of his unbuttoned shirt brushing against his chest. I didn't step forward to catch him. I knew better than to coddle the pride of a man who had just conquered his enemies while bleeding. He stopped directly in front of me, his commanding presence enveloping my space. Reaching into the pocket of his trousers, he retrieved a small, midnight velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. Such a gesture of civilian subservience did not belong in our violent world, nor did I want it to. We stood perfectly eye to eye, the silent understanding humming between us, heavier than any traditional vow. He flicked the box open with his thumb. Inside rested a diamond, cut with severe, unapologetic brilliance, set in a band of dark, brushed titanium that flawlessly mirrored the brutal aesthetic of his empire. "I am not asking you to stand behind me," Lee-Yeon murmured, his dark eyes burning with an ancient, fierce devotion that stripped me entirely bare. "And I am not asking you to simply share my name. A quiet life would have starved your soul, Areola. You were forged for the dark, just as I was." He took the ring from the velvet, carelessly discarding the box onto the windowsill. He reached for my left hand, his large, calloused fingers sliding over mine with agonizing tenderness. "Rule this syndicate with me," he whispered, his gaze locking onto mine, offering me not just his heart, but the absolute, terrifying weight of his crown. "Be my strategist, my wife, and my equal. Let them fear us both." I looked at the brutal, beautiful ring, then up into the eyes of the man I had secretly loved for 4 dangerous years. I didn't need to speak. I simply nodded, stepping forward to let him slide the heavy titanium onto my finger, sealing our invincible empire in blood and unbreakable steel. And that is where the dust finally settles on tonight's chapter. The storm has passed, the blood has dried, and the empire is theirs to rule, together. But in this world, absolute power always comes with a price, and the shadows are never truly empty. If your heart was racing during that penthouse breach, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next move in this dangerous game. Our syndicate is growing every single day, and I want to know exactly how far our territory stretches. Drop a comment down below letting me know what city or country you are watching from today. Until the next chapter, keep your enemies close and your loyalty closer.